Notes.
All right. We are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talking About Survivor. I am Christiana Ellis.
I am Mike Mateen.
Tonight, we're going to talk about Survivor Ghost Island episode 6. Where they revised and reimagined Ghost Island right out of existence.
Yes.
I mean, presumably it will come back, but...
Yeah, this was not what I was expecting when I saw ads calling for a, new twists on Ghost Island. I didn't think that the new twist would be, we just pretend it's not there.
Yeah, we're just not going to do it at all.
And not even address that we didn't do it.
Nope. Now that said, going from two tribes to 3 at this point, I like that. I feel like the smaller groups. Well, yeah. Yeah, I mean, but I guess I don't think that was a big, game-changing thing so much as just they didn't do it this week, right?
Yeah, I think it's because of the changes in the tribes and the desire to follow along with that we just didn't have a reward challenge. I mean, I think that that's why we didn't have a Ghost Island.
Yeah.
We didn't have a reward challenge, so once we have a reward challenge again, we'll have a Ghost Island again.
Yeah, that's my guess.
And it will be different. I don't know.
Yeah. But anyway, the episode just wastes no time at all. I mean, it opens right up with them arriving at the beach to drop their buffs.
Yes.
Michael calls it a saving grace because of how bad he was doing. But then, of course, he ends up kind of in the same boat, honestly. You know, his fellow castaways were a little mixed around, but otherwise he's kind of still having a rough time of it.
Yeah. And we talked about this before, but, with the fact that they are so stuck on these names that there's some awkward parts later when Probst is like, man, Malolo just can't get it together. And it's like, this isn't the same guys.
I know. I actually noted. I put that in my notes a couple of times too. It was just like, this is a different group of people.
Completely different.
Yeah.
But he just kept harping on it. Not, there was one where I think they addressed the Malolo name. Like they mentioned that the name of the tribe might be cursed.
Yeah.
Sort of an aside, but he kept drilling in like they were doing something wrong as the Malolo tribe when they're not the same tribe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I reacted to that too. And that was definitely weird because it's just like, that seems like an odd thing to focus on.
Right. When you mix the tribes up a bunch of times.
Mm-hmm. Probst might as well just say, oh, all you guys blur together at this point anyway. I'm only just looking at the color of your buff. It
was odd.
So. Yeah. But we actually got a little confessional from both Michael and James there at the beginning when they were announcing the mix-up. Michael called it a saving grace. James said it was the next phase of the game, the race to the merge. And then Desiree, initially unhappy with having to do a switch, but as you see, fate is the homie, which was, not that I'm necessarily up on every version of slang, but I felt like I had not heard that particular phraseology before. I mean, homie, sure, but fate is the homie. I don't know. I mean, I'm not criticizing. I was just interested. It's like, oh, I don't feel like I've ever heard something described quite that way before. Like to describe an abstract concept as the homie. Because she wasn't saying it's my friend. She was saying it like you have to do what fate says. That was the sort of context, and that I don't know. I just hadn't heard it used that way before.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say that the particular fate is the homie is like not that's not a phrase.
Well, no, that's not what I mean. I guess I mean just the idea of saying something is the homie when what you're saying about it is that you have to obey it or do what it says or whatever.
Well,
Because
I think it comes. Yeah, I knew I was like I know it comes from something, so I just like I pulled it up real quick on Google. It's from there is an expression Jesus is the homie,
oh, okay, all right.
which I'm not going to look at exactly like
Well,
where that all comes
it's
from, but it looks like it came from like a comedy routine.
mm,
It seems to be pretty popular. It has its own Twitter and stuff. So I'm
oh
guessing she's aware of that and has
yeah, it's a reference then, I guess.
right, yeah, appropriated this as a reference that
Okay,
we
well that's
didn't
interesting.
know and didn't get. So
Yeah, I probably wouldn't have commented on it at all, except it was also the name of the episode.
correct.
But anyway, they announced that we're switching from 2 to 3. We're still going to have Navidi and Malolo, but now we're also going to have Naguya in green. And they do their picks. We have 5 on each tribe. The new Navidi is Donathan, Bradley, Chelsea, Dominic, and Libby. The new Malolo is Desiree, Michael, James, Angela, and Kellen. Naguya is Sebastian, Wendell, Jenna, Chris, and Laurel. And I realized when I was trying to write all of those names down that there are 3 blonde women that I could not tell apart until I had to wait until they got their confessionals later when they were with each tribe, because I couldn't remember which was Libby and which was Kellen and which was Jenna. I mean, if they stood next to each other, I would tell them apart. But the group shots, I was like, oh, yeah, and a blonde woman. I don't know which one that is.
Yeah, even right now, I'm having trouble remembering which one's Libby and which one's Jenna. Kellen, I remember.
Yeah, Angela is a little easier to pick out just because she's a little older.
Yeah.
Thinner in the face. But anyway, yeah. There's a few of the women there that still kind of have not distinguished themselves amongst each other for me. I mean, like, I know things about each one, but not to the point where I can easily say which is which. Like, even right now, if you pulled up a picture of a randomized one.
I just looked up Libby. I'm not even positive that I remember ever seeing her.
Libby is the one that remember the idea that she was doing the cute, flirty routine and that she was the innocent girl who was just explaining how sometimes it's part of the game. You have to backstab. That was from a couple of weeks ago.
We don't see a lot from her.
Well, I mean, not any more than we see from any of the others.
Well, Kellen, we saw a lot more from her this week just because she was on
this week. Yeah, but I mean, we've seen Libby before, is my point.
Yeah, no, I get you.
Okay. But anyway, so the green tribe sucks for them because they get a new beach and have to build a shelter all over again. So that said, they seem like they're pretty happy as they all kind of connect to each other. Sebastian is happy to see Wendell, talks about his little souvenirs, seems very hung up on the fact that his seashell used to be alive.
Yes.
Mentions it several times. Let's see. Wendell talks about bonding with Chris and is relieved to not be in the position of being in between him and Dom anymore. Lots of people talking about this whole feud between Dom and Chris, considering that they don't actually talk to each other in this episode.
Yeah, it obviously was a big thing, and well, what I noticed from this was, I mean, we haven't talked about the other tribe yet, but it seemed that Dom got, like, he did better separated from this feud than I felt like Chris did.
Mm-hmm.
He was able to just kind of get this weight off his back and go and work and start playing his game the same way. Whereas Chris continued to kind of rub people the wrong way and have a little bit of an ego. All the things that got him and Dom in the thing to begin with, like he still maintained that. Like wasn't like he just kind of like relaxed. Now he didn't have like the guy that he was going after in Dom. Like, we didn't see any of that, but he just, I don't know. He came across to me more negatively in this episode than Dom did after having.
Yeah. I think part of that may just be that, like we had talked last time about him making a connection with Donathan, but it seemed like he was not able to read the room with this new group of people quite as well. Right. Like there's the whole bit about him, revealing the secret that he's a model, and Laurel going, "Yeah, really? Boy, who knew? What a shock."
Yeah, like
this totally transforms my image of you.
Yeah, and why was that a secret that why?
One point that Chris made that I thought was interesting, even if it came in the same sentence with him calling himself charismatic, is the idea of pointing out that someone who is obviously physically strong and someone who wants to make connections with people is that he's kind of seen as a target automatically by being strong, and so he doesn't have the luxury of playing a low-key under-the-radar game. And I'm not sure how true that is really, as much as he would have to play differently if he were going to do that. But I don't know that it really is something where he couldn't. If he just kind of didn't engage in the strategic part of the game and picked someone else to, have them be the person who always says everything and kind of just defer to them in the strategic part, use them as a shield. We've seen that before. So, I mean, I think that's something that could be done if he was interested in playing that way, which I think he's not. But certainly the way he's playing, he does attract attention. And I think he's maybe just reacting to the anxiety about attracting the attention and feeling like, well, gosh, I wish I could do this without attracting so much attention.
Yeah. I mean, my prediction for him, just based on the fact that it does take him a while to find his, he does genuinely want to make connections, but it takes him a while to kind of find that groove and how to do it. So we did see it with Donathan. Like he does have that ability, but it did take a while. I feel like he definitely makes the merge, but I don't see him making it too far after that because he has essentially built himself to be a charismatic, strong player, and people are just going to be like, it just makes him an easy target at that point. Especially depending on how the merge comes down and where the numbers fall and all that, I guess that could increase his longevity. But by, sort of declaring that I need to play hard because I am a charismatic, athletic player, you just you enable everybody else to think like that too, and be like, oh, well, yeah, I guess you are, so you are.
Yeah, it's kind of a self-fulfilling thing.
Right.
Because the other aspect of it is not that we would advise him to not work his hardest in the challenges, but I mean, to some extent, all of that stuff is within your control.
Right.
So anyway, that said, it's an interesting thing to consider, though, the idea of different people and what strategic options they practically have available to them. Because I think where he's at is that he feels that he doesn't have the luxury of playing an under the radar game, but I think it's not so much that he couldn't as much as he wouldn't be happy doing that. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we see this all the time where people create a strategy to meet how they want to do things.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess where I'm coming down on it is that I think he has a point, but that it's also true that he could
Yes.
do it differently if he wanted to.
This is one of the better versions of creating a strategy
Hmm.
to allow you to do what you want to do because it is rooted in some fact.
Yeah. Well, but so in any case, Chris's charisma is not working quite so much on Laurel and Jenna, and they agree that they're going to continue to humor him in the meantime because it seems like the key to dealing with him is let him go ahead and say whatever he wants to say and smile and nod, and then you don't have to keep having that conversation. Because I got the impression that he might be have a trait which I have definitely detected in myself sometimes, and lots of people have, which is this idea of if someone doesn't immediately agree with you, that means you just have to keep explaining your position, and you just have to keep explaining until they agree. Because obviously, if you explained it well enough, they would agree with you. So if they don't agree, then that means that the conversation isn't over yet.
Yeah.
And so, whereas they might have just said, you know what, if you just agree with him right away, you can stop. Anyway, let's see. Over at Malolo, Desiree, despite having that initial reaction of worrying about getting the mix-up, seems happy with how it worked out after the fact. We have James talking about the Chris and Dom feud, telling everybody about how it almost got Angela voted out. Michael is hoping at this point that she will be willing to work with him and James. He and James connect. And I think that there's hope there. But as it eventually turns out, I mean, I think ultimately they must have known that Angela was not actually that close to switching. In any event, let's see. James is wary. He doesn't necessarily want to work with Michael, but he's kind of left in a tough spot. Like, he doesn't have a lot of choices. He feels
Yep.
like, he's not going to be able to break into that trio of Kellen, Angela, and Desiree. So that leaves him with Michael, but that's a minority, so they have to just try to hope they can pull someone out. But it's kind of a tough position to be in. I was surprised, though, and we'll maybe get more to this later, of why James instead of Michael.
I think that they felt like they haven't they needed to keep, obviously. I think they probably felt like Michael was probably a little bit stronger. So if they do need to go into another challenge, he hasn't failed at a challenge like James did, and they did kind of make a thing of.
Well, you broke up a little bit there.
Did I freeze?
Yeah.
A little bit of a thing about that with, with why Desiree might be, targeted because she had the poor leadership in the challenge, and James was talking about how he had redeemed himself from it. So there may have been some conversation that we didn't see where they actually remembered, and James didn't actually ever haven't fully redeemed himself, and they just didn't bring it up to us because it would have tipped what had happened. So they might have just decided Michael was better for that part of it. Or James is kind of a known quantity to them because they were with him, because he was with them after the first switch, right? Like, he started with Michael and that group, and then he went over to Navidi with Laurel and all them.
Yeah, so after the first switch, James was with Angela, and Cullen and Desiree were on the other side. But James was with Angela after the first switch.
Okay, so maybe it wasn't that. So, I mean, I feel like just because they addressed it, that must have been what it was. Or there's something that we didn't see that made them feel like they just didn't trust James, and they thought maybe Michael could do them later. I don't know.
Yeah, and I wonder if they thought that they were being careful in case of some sort of an idol thing, because James called it a blindside at the end. Like he acted surprised,
Yeah.
which suggests that, unlike how it worked last week with Stephanie, where no one really knew for sure who it was going to be. There was definitely this sense that she was absolutely one of the ones on the chopping block, and it could easily be her. Whereas he seemed actually surprised, called it a blindside. Maybe that was just the fact that Michael turned on him might have been what he was referring to there.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's assume that he thought he was in the majority voting for Desiree. I mean, who did he think the other target? Like, who did he think they were telling Desiree to vote for?
Well, I think maybe he just was persuaded by Angela and maybe Michael that they were both with him and they were going to vote for Desiree, and it would be 3-2. And then the fact that both Michael and Desiree, or Michael and Angela, did actually vote for him, that was maybe what he was surprised by.
So you think that the blind side wasn't the fact that people were voting for him, it's that enough people were voting for him.
Right. He thought that they had managed the majority. He thought that they had managed to get the 3.
Right. And so this is, if that's the case, this isn't a criticism on your take on that. That's a very poor way for James to view the game. If he thinks it's a complete blind side that he went from the person who was potentially going to get voted out to the majority, and then to actually still be the one getting voted out. So
we've talked before about the idea of what a blindside means, and the reason that I would be more in line with calling this one a blindside in this specific context is because it's not so much that he had no idea he was in trouble, so much as Michael in particular, he thought was the one guy that was with him, and he voted for him too. So it wasn't he knew that Desiree and Kellen were going to vote for him, but he was surprised and taken off guard that Michael did too.
Right.
So so what's a blindside, what's not? We've talked about it, and I would agree in cases where it's just like, well, one person who was a swing didn't vote the way we thought, versus, like a true blindside where, they have no idea. But in this case, what I think is just going on is that he thought that he knew what was going to happen. It's not that he didn't know, and it was possible that it could go either way. He thought he was sure. Sounds like.
Yeah, that makes sense.
In any event, though, and that just the fact that, Angela and Michael had made their decision and yet maintained the fiction to James that he was safe. That's why I was wondering, like, did they think he might have an idol or something? Or they're just playing it safe? I mean, we've talked in the past, too, about how, as much as it feels like, sometimes when you think it's a sure thing, do you really have to trick them? And the answer is, well, why wouldn't you? Because, if they know, then...
Right, then they have more options of what they can do that would mess up what you're trying to do.
Right. So it's...
We've definitely seen that, where people have felt so confident that they've just come in and said, you know what, we're not even going to play around. We're going to be straight up with you. It's you.
Right.
Then that person says, okay, well, now I know I know all the cards on the table. I now have to figure out how to manipulate it.
Exactly.
Been successful.
Yeah. So in any event, at this point, we had James wary of working with Michael, but in a tough spot. And, in hindsight, Michael didn't have his back ultimately. Not that we can totally blame Michael for that. I mean, it's not his job to have James's back. But in any event, over at Navidi, we have Bradley, who's so glad to be back at the resort beach instead of the crappy garbage beach. And although, to an extent, Chelsea also seems to react pretty powerfully to being back at her, the home beach. And the two of them together, it makes it sound like there really is a dramatic difference between the beaches, which is just interesting given that they're not really focusing on it in any way other than having the players comment on it.
Yeah.
Because they've had in the past seasons where they made that explicit, that one beach was much nicer than the other.
Yes.
But anyway,
they haven't really, other than the reactions, they haven't really talked about it much.
Yeah.
And Bradley's interesting. I mean, because they do a lot of editing he obviously enables it, but it seemed like just a really big douche. And
yeah.
And I don't feel like he has any knowledge that he's like that. Like, I don't think he means to be like that. It's just innate in him.
I can imagine him being really dismayed watching this at home and just realizing that they're giving him this edit.
Yeah. I mean, again, he enables it. Like,
right.
That's
yeah.
one thing that I hate when people are like, oh, they're giving me a bad. Well, you did everything that's in the edit. Like, and yes, it can shade it one way or the other, but it is still stuff you did.
Yeah. Well, and we did also in a previous episode not only see him making his various complaints, but other people reacting to him in a negative way because of how he complains all the time.
Right.
So it's not just he complains the same amount as everybody else and they just chose to focus every time he does it. It's like, no, people actually felt like he complains a lot and has kind of an attitude. I did like that when he talks about how what I did like from him was the moment where he's saying, I maybe need to be careful because I feel like I'm playing an A+ game, but that might mean that I'm actually not. And it's that I'm just not aware of what's really happening.
100% true.
Yeah.
You are not playing an A+ game. He's not playing a terrible game, but he's definitely not playing an A+ game.
He hasn't really had to do anything yet. I mean, we can maybe give him some credit for keeping that that alliance of 5 together. And that's, I think it's fair to give him some credit for that, but he's not had to do a lot as a solo player.
No, he had to survive when he was in the majority and the minority was targeting him and he was distasteful enough that it was potentially him.
Yeah.
And he managed to survive that. But he did do that, so.
But yeah, in any event, we also have Dom, who's so relieved to not have Chris breathing down his neck anymore. And I just roll my eyes every time he said stuff like that because I'm just thinking Dom is like the guy who's like, well, sure, I sucker punched him, but boy, he just wouldn't let it go. I mean, it's like he started it.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, sure, I started the fight, but then he wouldn't stop it. I find Dom amusing, but it is, I roll my eyes when it's like, whew, relieved to not have that guy around anymore. And I'm like, there's only tension because you started it anyway. But he is also now, in the absence of having Chris to blame everything he talks about how Libby is playing the flirting game, and that means that she has to go. She's dangerous. And makes sure Bradley knows that she's dangerous too. And Bradley has this weird sort of entitled naivete to him where he reacts to that by going, really? Interesting. Gosh, Dom says she's dangerous. She must be dangerous, I guess. Like he has no ability to read any of this on his own. He just has to take Dom's word for it. That's kind of how it came across. It was a little bit weird, I thought.
Yes, that's what I'm saying is that, that's why I didn't want to just go out and proclaim that, he's this terrible player, because he is getting a weird edit. Like
Yeah.
he is like, and that's what I said. He's doing all of the things, but they're taking just odd stuff like that and making it like the focus of what his character is like, you know, and it makes him seem like he is completely unengaged or he has no, like literally no idea of like what's happening in reality. Like,
Right. He's just like, he's just 15% out of phase with everybody else on the beach.
right. And they're blowing that up to make it seem like he's just like literally completely out of phase with all of them because they focus on those moments where he is. So, you know, it's an odd thing to watch.
Yeah.
You watch him and you're like, this guy sucks. And then you realize he doesn't even know. He has no idea. And then you see stuff like this and you're like, he doesn't, like, does he really not see this in Libby? And he just automatically takes Dom's word for it? Or do they take out the part of like, you know, I've been curious about, you know, I've been worried about Libby a little bit, and then Dom confirmed it by, and then they get the like. That's why I have to start to wonder. You know, I mean, he did say the things, but anyway.
Yeah. In any event, that pretty much brings us to the immunity challenge.
Yep.
There's now a 2-part immunity idol because there's 3 tribes. So, I like, you know, certainly the idea of the blindfolds and the collar is, you know, that's old hat for Survivor at this point. But they had like some of the like having to dig through the, you know, the wood chips and uncovering the buried one. I thought those were kind of fun, small wrinkles to that whole thing. But then, boy, what happened with Desiree? Because she got her team to start the puzzle first, and then they lost, got last place. I guess just the puzzle part was, you know, she was good at telling everybody where to go and organizing that with the different pairs, but not as good with having them solve the puzzle, I guess.
And so this was funny. I didn't really even catch at the time, like I wasn't paying attention to like her doing poorly, other than that they weren't advancing. But my wife was watching with me, and she looked over and she was like, if I was doing this and that was my caller, I would walk away and take my blindfold off. I wouldn't even participate. And I was like, really? She's like, yeah, that, like, she's just being so aggressive, and like it just doesn't, like, she's not being clear. And I was like, I didn't pick up any of that. And, you know, again, she doesn't watch this show a lot. So it was interesting, though, that kind of she sat down and picked up immediately that, like, Desiree was not effective in that part of it and was actually, like, frustrating, which then, of course, compounds on itself because then they aren't doing well. And then she gets more and more, like, you know, frustrated, and she frustrates them more.
It was either Angela or Kellen. I'm not sure which, because they had their blindfolds on, but there was at one point one of them kind of trying to calmly saying, I'm doing the best I can. Please stop yelling at me. Which I actually reacted to, not so much that Desiree was doing it wrong as much as like, she kind of can't stop yelling at you. I mean, that's kind of what we're doing here. But I take the point, but that's
right. And see, that's the thing, is that you know, Abby said that prior to that happening, that she was like, I wouldn't even deal with this. Like, and I was like, really? And then so I kind of was a little bit more in tune to it at that point. So you know, so by seeing that from a third party watching it just on TV and feeling that same way, I think that either Kellen or Angela, whichever it is, I think that was a appropriate response, you know. And because the other, like, it wasn't that you shouldn't be like giving me instructions. It was the yelling of, like, it just started to feel like very unhelpful yelling. And that's why she described it as yelling. Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, I mean, it's true. It didn't, they were ahead and they got beat by people who had left pieces behind.
Yeah. Although to give Wendell credit, they left the pieces behind, but then they also got first place. So he did really well with the puzzle. It's like the almost kind of the opposite scenario where, like, he maybe didn't have it as organized when he was just moving people around, but when it got to the puzzle, he he was able to do that part really well. Because
one other quick thing about the losing the puzzle piece is obviously this was a good reminder that obviously they get very clear description of all the rules at the beginning, because there are plenty of times where if this had happened, Wendell would have been required to go get it and then, or whoever, to go get it and then still complete the entire, like, not obstacle, but it wasn't really
well,
the
fact that he was able to carry it back instead of making one of the blindfolded pairs do it.
Right. He was able to run, go get it, and go and bring it back. It was odd because that isn't normally how that goes. Like, normally if you leave something or have to go back, you have to do the whole thing the same way that the mechanisms were built. Whereas he was able just to run, get it, and come back, which helped them, obviously. You know, he didn't have to, like, take the whole team back, get the thing, and come back through.
Right. I mean, I suppose it's not really like the idea of just remembering to bring the like all 3 bags. Yeah, I'm just thinking is like they don't, you know, that's not supposed to be one of the hard parts of the challenge, I guess. But you're right that, like, in many other challenges, they would still do it another way. But in any event, obviously, they allowed it to happen the way it did, and that's fine. But so he manages to get them to first place, even with all that. And Malolo and Navidi were very close, but ultimately Navidi got second place. And then this is, you know, where Probst says, sending Malolo back to tribal council for the 3rd straight time. And I had the same note that you mentioned earlier, which is like, but it's a whole different group of people now. I mean, even if there's some overlap, it's like,
it's one guy who's been there 3 straight times.
Yeah, it's I don't see how it's meaningful to refer to it that way, and it wasn't the only time either. So,
right.
Although poor Michael at this point talking about, like, he's been to 5 out of 6 of the tribal council so far.
Yeah.
And it's weird because for someone who is obviously been identified as a possible target kind of almost since the beginning and keeps going to tribal council, he also somehow keeps not being the one that people actually target.
Yeah.
It's a little bit strange. I think there were times that they thought, you know, I wonder if it's about them wondering still if he might have an idol. Maybe that's why.
True. Yeah, maybe. Actually, yeah.
People don't want to take the chance. But in any event, we have Desiree taking the loss hard. She's used to exceeding expectations. She feels like she failed the tribe. And I mean, she did kind of, although it's like this type of challenge, more than most of them really, do kind of hinge on one person who takes the leadership role, right? I mean, the people who are blindfolded, there's only so much they can do. Right? they can do their best to follow instructions, but it's really more than most. Like, even if we want to talk about the one where James did so poorly, like, there were still lots of other parts of that challenge that other people were in charge of. You know, like he messed up his part, but it was also the whole tribe doing their own thing. Whereas this one, it really is kind of Desiree's in charge of all of it.
Yep.
You know, and I think some of the fake out in this episode was Angela, you know, continuing to harp on those elements of it, even though she was actually still going to vote for James.
I didn't feel very much faked out in this.
Well, it wasn't so much that I felt faked out about it as much as I felt them trying to fake us out.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely tried to fake us out. The tipping point, which they did last episode also, and I guess it's just, again, we've watched a lot of Survivor, so we're more in tune to this stuff. But when they give James the whole, like, you know, Korean heritage and how he, you know, his whole, like, I moved to America on my own at 16 and all this stuff. And Desiree doesn't really get that same.
She kind of did, though. She got a lot more than we've seen from her so far.
She got more coverage, but it was definitely not. It was more of like her like wanting to do better. I'm usually a good leader. I didn't do well this time. Whereas his was the emotional like heartstring thing. And
yeah, that's true.
And that's where to me, like that triggered it for me. It's like, yeah, I mean, they want us to feel for him, that he's not just this guy who failed at a challenge a couple of weeks ago, sort of disappeared, and now gets voted out.
I think it's kind of a shame ultimately that he's gone. Not that I wanted it to be Desiree instead necessarily, but just because I feel, I don't know, just instinctively, I sort of felt like James had the potential to do better than he ended up doing on this season. I don't know.
Yeah.
Not sure what it is that I'm reacting to exactly. But
he ended up in some tough situations and didn't handle them well, which again is part of the game.
Mm-hmm.
But he struggled at that challenge. His response out of it was not great.
Yeah.
He didn't barely survive, but he it wasn't his gameplay that saved him at that point. It was that there were other choices that came that were more prevalent, like were better choices than him. And then he kind of started to redeem himself, which I think what you're feeling is that you started to see when he got into a comfortable situation, he started to play very well, and he started to connect with people and again redeem himself a little bit. And then he got into this, and it didn't really feel like he did anything wrong other than be unaware that he was the primary target, which is hard to criticize him for. I mean, I did a little bit earlier.
Well, and I don't even think that it was that he didn't know he was the target as much as he was persuaded by Michael and Angela that they were voting with him.
A unanimous target.
Right.
He missed that was a potential,
and
didn't take enough other than just trusting Michael and Angela. Like he didn't really do anything else, to try to make sure or have backup or stack the deck. I mean, again, sometimes you can't do that, but it just, there wasn't really much more to it other than like.
I mean, I feel like you're maybe underselling what he did a little bit, because even though obviously it didn't ultimately work, we did see him talking to Angela and having the whole conversation about, well, if you stay with Desiree and Kellen, you're on the bottom of that three, whereas you wouldn't be on the bottom with us. I mean, he had that whole scene with her.
Okay, yeah, I am underselling it. You're right. He did do that, which. I think the problem is at that point I had already seen the emotional edit, and I had sort of checked this off as like, well, it's probably going to be him. And so his play to Angela felt false to me, because I knew, and especially like the way that they, when they showed her kind of like staring off into space, and they were like, no one knows what's going on in her head, and try to make it seem like she's just like not all there. That was a little odd too. It felt a little overplayed.
Right? Because after that scene with Angela and James, we have Kellen giving her pitch to Angela. The episode is pitching itself as being all about Angela's this possible swing vote. And Kellen talks about, it's like, well, okay, what we did in the last set of groups was we just stayed strong with our alliance and we got through it. And Angela kind of gives lip service to it, but Kellen is feeling like she's not fully committed. And I get the impression that that's sincere, in the sense that obviously Angela did ultimately vote with them, but that Kellen did genuinely feel that Angela is not as with them as she wanted her to be.
Oh, definitely. That it was all, everything that happened. I mean, I don't feel like it was a misshading of what happened and how people truly felt. It just, the lingering edit of an unrelated shot of Angela, eating and kind of staring off into space, while Kellen talked about how she's like skeptical of her and she doesn't know what she's thinking. She can't figure her out. It overplayed how it was put together to me. Angela's not she's not completely disassociated with what's going on. They just aren't sure where she lies, and that doesn't make her disassociated.
Right.
Which is how that played it. But anyway.
So that brings us to the tribal council, and Probst hits on the whole worst tribe ever sort of thing again, which again is like,
they're not a tribe. They're just people that have been shuffled around literally just a day before.
Yeah. And poor James was just in a rough place with this tribal council because of the whole thing of wanting to try to say that it should be Desiree because of how she messed up the challenge, except that because he got a second chance, so to speak, after messing up a challenge, it's hard for him to really be as forceful on that point as he would otherwise like to be. And that's tough. I feel like he expressed it well, but it's just not a very strong position to be in.
Well, yeah, and this was another one of those things when I still feel like my thoughts on James are the fact that he ended up in some difficult situations and maybe didn't handle them perfectly. This was, again, another one. It was a tough spot for him because the whole thing was predicated on voting for somebody for a reason that he himself had survived. And that's just a difficult thing to navigate. And while he didn't necessarily do it correctly, he ended up in a lot of tough situations.
Yeah. So there's, we do have Angela, pretty much everything she actually says in the tribal council superficially would seem to suggest that she's leaning towards voting for Desiree. But at the same time, as we have observed in the past, that frequently, when they're trying to lean hard in order to create the drama when it's otherwise perhaps a foregone conclusion, they can end up I have my note is she seems pretty down on Desiree, but is that just the cover? And obviously, I think in hindsight it was. But she talks about this idea that okay, everyone's a team, but some challenges have these leadership positions and nobody forces you to volunteer for them. But if you do, there are expectations, that you have to be able to fulfill that responsibility. There's discussion of whether you play in a moment-to-moment mode or if you're viewing the long game. I think in this context, though, this has been kind of... this season feels like everybody is in moment-to-moment mode. I don't think there's been a single episode that so far this season where it felt like someone really had a long-term strategy that they were putting into effect.
But to be fair to them, though, the setup of has not enabled that. Oh, good.
Yeah, you broke up again. Yeah. Yep.
To be fair to them, though, the setup of the season has not enabled long-term planning because they keep shifting everybody around.
Yeah, that's true.
More frequently than usual. That makes it very difficult to, not be in the moment to moment.
Right.
So.
Well, I know, and I'm not trying to be critical of the players so much as just observing that there hasn't really seemed to be anyone in long game mode. So this whole discussion of if you're making your choice based on moment to moment or long game is like nobody's making their choice based on long game. You can't. It keeps shifting too much.
Right. So I think where we're neither of us is wanting to go is the fact that, Probst seems to be not at the top of his game on this one because he's asking questions like that. The focus on this worst tribe ever that's not really even a tribe. The bizarre way that he felt like he had a smugness to him, how cool is this question? Do you play with your head or your heart? Which really didn't matter.
Well, yeah, it might as well ask them if they like puppies or kitties. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
um,
So
yeah,
I don't think he's like losing it or anything, but this hasn't been, he wasn't in peak form.
yeah, it feels a little bit more disconnected. It's a little bit more superficial and asking like abstract questions rather than really drilling into what's going on with these specific people compared to previous seasons.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to go ahead and give the black sheep nod to Kellen for refusing to play along with that question. Head or heart? And we get two even splits of head versus heart. And then she says, you know, I actually think that your gut is like the perfect balance. And I'm just like, oh my God. I mean, I loved it, but it's also just, I feel so ambivalent about that sort of thing because on the one hand, being the one person who has to reinvent the question is a little bit obnoxious. Yeah. But on the other hand, it was a bullshit question. So it's
right.
Not taking it seriously is perfectly legit. So I loved that and rolled my eyes at the same time.
Yes.
In any event, we get to the votes. Desiree votes for James. She says, you or me, I hope it's you. James votes for Desiree, says he wishes he could give her a second chance. But then I think the surprise was, or at least the part that I was surprised by, was that it was unanimous. It's one thing to have, Angela choose that decide, but it must have been clear enough that Michael chose to vote with the majority instead of trying to save James. That suggests that Michael knew what Angela was going to do.
Yes.
Yep. So we get James a little surprised. I think initially he gives some dirty looks. I think maybe just trying to say like, wait, what just happened? That didn't play out like I thought. Like, it's one thing to lose, but there also should have been at least one more vote go for Desiree. So how did that not happen?
Yeah. Unanimous against me.
Yeah. He was he was a good sport in his final words and all, but there was that a moment there of like, wait a minute, someone screwed me over here. Anyway, though,
well, I mean, I think it's interesting that you call that out when we don't normally do that, because it did feel like that. Like, it felt like we were anticipating a potential, like, very negative, whatever they call that, the post voting out interview. Like, that's what he looked like in that moment, and then he delivered a very different speech to his response to his interview at the end, and I felt the same way. Like. And so it's interesting that we both noted the difference in how he left versus how he presented himself.
Well, and I think that's what sort of emphasizes this whole idea that he was genuinely surprised by how it played out, because that reaction at first was like, wait a minute, that's not right. What happened? And having to think through it. And I think once he kind of got there, he was able to be at peace with it. But there was a moment of frustration, I think, of like, wait a minute, it wasn't resigned to like, oh, well, I tried my best. It was more like, hey, wait a minute. But
right.
Anyway.
I think it's also part of it. It sort of solidified the 2 points that you and I have both been making about him, in that your point is that it felt like he could have done better. And this was another example. Like, he was so composed in that interview that you like him. Like, you wanted to like him. You wanted him to do better. You felt like he could have done better.
I feel like I feel like I liked him from the first episode, and I don't know, he just kind of clicked with me that I was like, yeah, well, I like him. I want him to do well, and then he didn't really.
Right, and so this little piece kind of capstones that, in the fact that, like, that delivery is why you think he could do better, and the thing that I was feeling, in that he kept getting put in tough situations, but he wasn't necessarily handling them correctly. Same thing, like, he got blindsided. and he had this look like it just, his confusion looked like made him look angry, like we were expecting like something to like come out at the other end.
Mm-hmm.
And so it goes back to like he just got put in a tough spot. Like he got blindsided when he thought he was totally safe and he was confused.
Yeah.
And so yeah, maybe he didn't handle that as smoothly as possible right out the gate. But that's kind of been his thing. And so yeah, I think we're, even though we saw different shades of it, we're on the same page with him in that he could have been better, and I wanted him to be better. So.
Yeah. So next time, because Probst inceptioned the idea into them, they decide that the Malolo flag is cursed and they're going to burn it. And I'm like, okay, all right, sure, why not? Burn it all down. And then Bradley and Dom argue because I think Bradley is Bradley and Dom is incapable of not arguing with somebody. He has to find someone to argue with.
Yes.
It's in his nature. Who is it, Nietzsche, that said if God did not exist, man would be forced to invent him? No, it wasn't Nietzsche. Nietzsche wouldn't say that. Someone did. Some philosopher did. And I'm just thinking of that because it's like, if Dom did not have someone to argue with, he would. You're breaking up, I think, when you're trying to tell me who said it.
Voltaire.
Voltaire. That sounds more right. I don't think Nietzsche would have said, he was the one that said God is dead.
Yes.
So probably, if God was dead, man would be forced to, I don't know. Never mind. Who cares? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about how next time we're going to see Bradley and Dom argue on Survivor. So
that pretty much wraps it up.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Thank you for listening and or watching, and we'll be back next week to talk about the next episode of Survivor Ghost Island.
Yay.
Yay. Night, everybody.